We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Aleph Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 95a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing the teaching of Rav Huna related to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if a buyer buys a lot of grain, so it's to be expected that there's going to be a certain amount of impurity in the grain. The Mishnah said that it's expected that there's a quarter of a kav per every saw. And Rav Huna said, let's say the buyer actually sifts through and finds more than a quarter of a kav of impurity, so he's actually allowed to be reimbursed for the entire thing. We don't say that he just gets reimbursed for the excess of impurity more than the quarter kav per saw, but for all of it he actually gets reimbursed. And the Gemara is in the middle of asking a question on Rav Huna. The Gemara is asking from a teaching of Rav and Bar Rav Nachman on an upcoming Mishnah. It's talking about buying land, a very similar kind of case where the person ends up buying land and getting more land than the seller was really selling to the buyer. And on the Mishnah, Rav and Bar Rav Nachman teaches that the buyer has to return to the seller everything that is extra, not only that which is beyond what is to be expected as extra, but everything that is extra has to be returned, and that seems to be in line with Rav Huna. And the Gemara now says you can't really compare the Mishnah later on with Rav Huna's case, because Hasam over there, hein chaser, hein yaser amarle, the way that he sold the land to him in that case was, he said, it might be a little less, it might be a little more. And the Gemara continues, miu reveal lo chashav, nevertheless, a quarter of a kav, meaning the area where you plant a quarter of a kav of seeds, is not considered important, but yeser may revia chashav, but if it's more than that amount of land, that is considered important. The kevon de chazi leilit starufe betishas kav, and since that's an amount of land that can be joined together with 9 kav, havela aracha shifta biape nafsha, that's considered to be important land on its own. Some people take out this line over here that it could be joined with 9 kav, but regardless, the point is, once it's a larger amount of land, it's considered to be important, it's considered to be chashiv, v'hadra, and it returns. And so essentially what the Gemara is saying is that the case later on is different because there was a phrase added in the sale of hein chaser, hein yaser, and since that phrase was added, that's why all of it is returned if it's in excess, but that might not be true in our situation when we're talking about impurities within the grain that is being sold. And we will take a look at the Rashbam in the previous summer that explains this distinction. Hachi hashta, how can you compare the case later on by land to our case? Hasam gave a base core offer over there by the case where an amount of land is being sold, a base core, mida bechevel ani mocher loch. Let's say he says, I'm selling you exactly that amount of land as measured by the rope. So bedinu du machzer lo es kol harivoim. So then actually any amount extra would have to be returned to make karlo akni le mocher midi beyisor al midas hachevel. Because in such a situation, if it's phrased in that way, the seller is selling nothing extra beyond the measure. But because in that Mishnah later on, the cases where the seller said to the buyer explicitly, hein chaser, hein yeser, that it might be a little less, it might be a little more, so that's why it's a possibility that we say in such a case the buyer can keep the extra. But if you don't say that, then he can't get anything extra beyond the base core, even the smallest amount extra. And so Hilkach, therefore, since that's the halacha by land, if you're going to have an extra amount of land that's even beyond what is to be expected, more than the rova l'sa, lo hava mechila klal, there's not going to be any forgiveness at all when it comes to the land. The karka chashavu b'fnei atzma, because land on its own is considered important. The lahachi ahani ma'damer le base core, that's why I said base core. V'hai dekamer le hein chaser hein yeser, and when he adds the words hein chaser hein yeser, miu lahachi ahani, it does help. The ilo have a yeser al hamida ki im rova hu machale, if it would just be a small amount of extra land, so then he'd forgive it. Aval yeser me rova lo hava mechila klal. However, if it's more than that rova, if it's more than that quarter kav of land, there's no mechil at all, v'hadr, and then it's going to be returned. And so the idea is, since by land, the only reason he's allowed to keep any extra is because of that phrase, hein chaser, hein yeser, but if the amount extra is beyond what is to be expected, so everything is returned, and you cannot compare it to our case with the impurities within the wheat. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof to what Rav Huna said, ha'ona, when it comes to exploitation, talking about a transaction, pachos mishasus, if the amount of exploitation either to the seller or the buyer is less than 1/6, nikne mekach, then the purchase is acquired, the sale goes through. Yoser mishasus, if the amount of exploitation is more than 1/6, batel mekach, so then the sale is nullified. Shasus, if it's exactly 1/6, kane, so then he acquires, the sale does go through. Umachzer ona, but whatever the amount of exploitation was, that has to be returned. And so the Gemara says, Amai, now why is that the case that all of the ona has to be returned? Lahadr ad pachos mishasos, why not just return the amount so that you get yourself within less than 1/6? Shma'amina, so don't we see from here, kol hechi deboy lahadure, anytime you do have to return, kula mahadir, everything has to be returned, and that seems to be in line with what Rav Huna said. And the Gemara says, Hachi hashta, how are you making a comparison between the two cases? Hasame kara shava b'shava amarle, over there, originally he told him he's selling it for exactly the value. Miu pachos shasus mishasus lo yadia. Nevertheless, if it's less than 1/6, it's not really known. It's something that's a very small amount. Lo yadia b'money. It's not known in terms of the money of the transaction. U'mochel inish, and a person is mochel that. And shasus yadia, when it comes to 1/6, so then already it's known. V'lo mochel inish, and people are not mochel on that. And yeser mishasus, if it's more than 1/6, mekach tosu vatal mekach, then already it's a mistaken purchase, and the entire sale will be nullified. And the Rashbam explains, Shava b'shava amar le mocher lelokeach, when the seller sold to the buyer, he told him he was selling it at exactly the value. Uvekach nisratz lelokeach, that's what the buyer agreed to. V'meino shavin, really, if it was not a fair sale, lo yisratz, if it wasn't exactly what it was worth, he really wouldn't be willing to go through with it. V'hilkach, and therefore, bidinhu dafilu pachas mishasas yachzer, therefore, when it comes to onah, when it comes to exploitation, if you're applying the strict halacha, even less than 1/6 should be returned. Miu, nevertheless, lakachein machzer, the only reason you don't return that is, dekemen de lo yedia kolkach, since it's hard to know that small amount of exploitation, ucheshav edami, it's basically at the same value as the item being sold, have a mechila. There we say there is mechila, there's forgiveness, avol shasus, but once you get to a 6, the yedihi, that's known, velo machil midi, he's not going to be mochil at all, and that's why the entire onah has to be returned. It could be that's not the same when it comes to the cases of the sale of grain, avol gabe peiros, when it comes to the sale of produce to grain, let's say, the orcha de mil sehi sheyesham tinofis, it's normal that there would be some amount of impurity. So hasam vada ikalamemer demachal lagamri, there you can say there's a full mechila. Ve'afilo hecha deika yeser meirova, even if there was an amount of impurity that's more than the quarter kav that's expected, but still harova miu have a mechila. But on the quarter kav, that amount of excess, we can say there is mechila, and therefore you cannot compare the two cases. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come and hear a proof from the following Brisa to Rav Huna. Hamakabel sadam echaver lita, if somebody receives a field from his friend, he's supposed to plant trees in the field. Hareza makabel all of eser borios lameya. So the owner of the field has to expect, he has to accept upon himself that there might be 10 deficient trees for every 100. Yoser mikan, but if there's more than that amount of deficient trees, megalglin all of esakol. So then the person planting is responsible for all of it. That seems to be like Rav Huna. He's not only responsible for the deficient ones above the expected amount, he's responsible for all of the deficient ones. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua, Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua says, Kol yeser mikan, if you have more than that number of deficient trees, that's already like its own field, Kebal lita mitchila dami, it's like he's planting from the outset. And the Rashbam explains, Hamakabel poel shemakabel olav b'schar lita kol sadeh chaver. If you have a worker and he accepts upon himself to plant trees in his friend's field and he'll be paid, kishir sheyachol lita, he's expected to plant the amount of trees that normally go in that field. Kagon mimata asar lebesa, for example, 10 trees for a besa. Makabel olav bal hasadeh eser borios lameya. So the owner of the field has to assume that there might be 10 deficient trees. Im yesh asar ilanos boros sheinos and peirei. There might be 10 trees that don't produce fruit. Lo yitzdarach makabel lita acherim tachtein. It's not going to be expected of the worker to plant others instead of them. That's an expected amount of barren trees. He forgives that. Yeser mikan, but if there's more than what's expected, could go in Yud Aleph Lamea, for example, 11 per every 100. So Megalgalin all of us hakol Yitalo Yud Aleph Ilanos Tachten. He has to plant now 11 trees instead, not just one. The Hashlo like a Mechila Klal, because at that point there's no forgiveness at all. El Nami and Bola Nafos Menafes Kulo Ravuna. That seems like Ravuna, where when you're filtering out, when you're sifting through the impurities, you have to reimburse for the entire thing, just like Rav Huna said. And the Gemara answered that they're different. Amar Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua, Kol yeser meyeser borios lakuf. If you have more than 10 bad trees per 100, ein lanu l'chayv l'achzer v'litas hayeser al eser ilanos levad. It wouldn't make sense to only plant, let's say, 1 tree or whatever was extra beyond the 10. Daharehu ba'oso moser keshabal lita oso kilu ba'achshav lita sada acher mitchila dami. Because when you view those 10 trees, it's like you're planting an entirely new field. Sharei karka harbe yesh sharoy lita. That's a lot of land that you can plant on. V'chashav sada shalim b'fnei atzmo. It's like its own field. V'hareu ki'ilu lo asa klum. It's like he did nothing. Meikar mikablanuso. It's like he did nothing in this field. Sharei kibel sada lita, because he said he was going to plant a field. V'adayin kashiyesh yeser miyud borios. When you have more than 10 barren trees, harei yesh lo sada lita. You have a whole field there that still needs to be planted. And so therefore, that's why in that particular situation it's different. And the Rashbam here continues, Aval gabi tinofis, but again, by impurity within grain, yeser meiroba l'sa, let's say you have impurity that's more than a quarter kav per sa, kevan de roba shchiach, again, since a quarter kav is normal to have, machal, that already he forgives, and that's why these two cases are different. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Martif shel yayin v'chulu. If a seller sells to a buyer a cellar of wine, so then the buyer accepts that there might be 10 barrels out of 100 that are sour wine. And the Gemara says, Hey Chidami, what exactly is the case? What did the seller say to the buyer when he was selling him this wine cellar? Ida amar le martif shel yayin stam. If he said, I'm just selling you a wine cellar, so then kasha, that's going to be difficult, as we will see. And Ida amar le martif zeh shel yayin. And if he said, I'm selling you this particular wine cellar, so kasha, that's also going to be difficult, as we're about to see. And the Gemara now explains, Ida amar le martif zeh kasha. If he says to him, I'm selling you this wine cellar, it's difficult. Titania, because we learned in the Brisa as follows. Martif shel yayin ani mochelach. If he says, I'm selling you a wine cellar, so no sin lo yayin shakulo yafet. The Brisa here says you have to give him a cellar full of barrels of wine that are all good. You're saying, I'm selling you, in general, a wine cellar, all the barrels of wine, and that wine cellar have to be good quality. And the Brisa continues, Martif zeh shel yayin ani mochelach. If he says, I'm selling you this wine cellar of wine, so then no sin lo yayin hanimkar bechanus. He can give him wine, but it doesn't have to be the best quality wine. It could be wine that's ready to be sold in the store. Essentially, that's wine that might be beginning to go bad. And finally, the Brisa says, Martif zeh ani mochelach. If he says, I'm selling you this wine cellar, he doesn't even say shel yayin of wine, so then afilu kulo chometz, even if it's all vinegar, higio, that's still considered to be a good sale. And so you see, if you say martif zeh ani mochelach, the whole thing can be vinegar, so that wouldn't fit with our Mishnah, which again, our Mishnah says that you have to accept 10 bad barrels among 100. And so the Gemara answers, liolam damarle martif shel yayin stam. So we'll say that really our Mishnah is talking where he says, I'm selling you a wine cellar. Vitani bereisha de brisa, and in the beginning of the brisa, the way we had the brisa, it said that if you say, I'm selling you a wine cellar, so all of the wine in the wine cellar has to be good. That's not exactly true. It should say in the beginning of the brisa as follows, Umekabel olav eser kosasos lameh, that he accepts upon himself 10 barrels that have sour wine out of 100. But the Gemara continues, Uvestami Makabel, is that really true? If you sell a wine cellar stam, the person accepts upon himself that there will be bad barrels of wine. Vatani Rav Yechia, but didn't Rav Yechia teach, Hamocher chavis yayin lechaver, if somebody sells a barrel of wine to his friend, nosin lo yayin shakulo yafa, the whole barrel has to be good. And the Gemara says you can't bring a proof from one barrel. Shani chavis is different by a barrel. Tekula chad chamru, that's all one unit, so to speak, of wine. And so therefore, of course, there it all has to be good. That has nothing to do with selling a wine cellar. But the Gemara still continues and asks, V'atani Rav Zavid devei Rav Oshia, didn't Rav Zavid teach in the yeshiva of Rav Oshia, Martif shel yayin ani mochelach, if he says, I'm selling you a wine cellar, he says it essentially stam, then nosin lo yayin shakulo yaf, it says in this brisa, all the wine has to be good. Martif zeh shel yayin ani mochelach, if he says, this particular wine cellar of wine I'm selling to you, nosin lo yayin shakulo yaf, so then he has to give him all good wine, umekabel olav eser kosasos lameh, and in this case, the buyer accepts upon himself that there might be 10 barrels of sour wine for every 100, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Hey Amud Beis.